International News Review.
It is time for Steve Okun, the Senior Advisor at McClarty Associates, and our International News Review. Good morning, Steve. Let's see your wallet.
Good morning, GVZ. Good morning, other guy.
No, I think this is starting to stray into disparaging territory now. Now I'm just the other guy.
Disparaging territory. Nice. Very nice. How you doing today, Steve?
I've got, my wallet, I had enough points on SQ, so I just get whatever they give out.
There you go.
Is flying so much. So
and that was what, 17 or 18 months ago at least, as we know, right?
I think about 5 years ago. Yeah.
So it's not much newer than my wallet then.
There you go. All right, Steve, lots going on in the world today. Let's start first. A U.S. journalist who was detained in Myanmar finally, after 25 days in detention, nobody had heard from him. He finally had a court appearance this past week.
He works for an organization called Frontier Myanmar, and I've been a subscriber to their news service for quite some time now, and it's extremely good news service. It's extremely unbiased and open. I mean, they were founded 5 years ago, so this wasn't something that came up just for the coup. But this was founded on the principle that high quality journalism is what is important to have a functioning democracy. And so this was an American. He's worked with them for a few years. He's their managing editor. The military junta passed a law right after the coup saying basically, if we don't like what you write, we're going to arrest you, and we don't even have to tell you what it is. And that's what they did to him about 3 weeks ago. And he's been unseen for those 25 days, held in insane prison. Had a quick hearing, and now he's gone again.
You mentioned there, Steve, American. That was the point that jumped out to me. He's an American journalist. It shows, at least to me, extraordinarily boldness, shall we say, that they're now detaining openly U.S. journalists. What are the potential international repercussions of this?
Well, he's the second U.S. journalist they've detained. It shows that the military junta has no fear, that there has been no effective pressure whatsoever from the international community, certainly not from ASEAN at all. And you would hope this would be a wake-up call to say, if they're going to just be arresting Americans, arresting journalists, not living up to their commitments under typical conventions where the U.S. embassy and consular officials would get access to a prisoner. The junta's not doing that. That hopefully this will get some concerted action against the military government, but I don't think anybody's holding their breath.
Yeah, Steve, I believe that was on Thursday when Danny Fenster, the journalist, had his court appearance, just 37 years old. We're not sure when his next one is going to be. I think they said there was another one coming up. But just yesterday, the UN voted, the UN General Assembly called on a halt to the flow of weapons into Myanmar. 119 countries approved it. China, Russia did not. 37 other members did not vote. So at least there is some global recognition or international recognition beyond ASEAN, which we often talk about in relation to Myanmar, that something needs to be done here in Myanmar.
Yeah, but I mean, the military has enough weapons to be used against civilians, and so yeah, I mean, sure, that's a nice step, and it should have been done, weeks ago, and had been blocked at the UN. But until really ASEAN, starts to do what they said they were going to do, however many weeks, it's been well over a month and a half now. Are we going to see any real change? So we've got to get more than that. And as Neil pointed out, the junta is brazen, right? They're not afraid of anything right now.
Well, on that point, Steve, just more broadly, it's interesting to me that it's happened in the same week that, the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily in Hong Kong, of course, was raided, and several prominent editors in that department, in that office, were arrested. There seems to be a slight trend here of late where more brazen governments are going after democratic or even, less than favorable supporting government news organizations. Are you seeing that? Do you sense there's a trend here, this brazenness to go after any dissenting voices?
Yeah, I mean, you see a real worrying split of the world into democracies versus, authoritarian, governments, and you see an open debate now. Can one country talk about what's happening from the internal affairs of another country? China made very clear that has always made very clear they don't want to have any discussion whatsoever about what's happening, in Tibet, in Xinjiang, with Hong Kong, maybe potentially with Taiwan at some point. But you even heard that discussion here in Singapore. There was an extraordinarily interesting celebration of the U.S.-Singapore 55th, the 55th year of relations between the two governments. And Ambassador Chan, the former U.S. ambassador, the former Singaporean ambassador to the U.S., said it should be a principle that there is non-interference from one country to another country. So it is getting to be a very broad discussion, and it's why we really need to beef up our multilateral institutions.
Yeah. Speaking of China, there was an economic story that came out this week as well, which is our next topic. And that is President Xi Jinping has established or announced a top deputy to push the domestic chip production in China to overcome U.S. sanctions that were put on by the Trump administration. And we all know chips are, the chip manufacturing segment is very important. And what do we make of this new appointment?
Well, I mean, it's this whole debate. Are we going to have a decoupling between, the U.S. and China? Are we going to have a decoupling between, two different blocks? And of course we are. We've been having this decoupling. China has been decoupling for quite some time. You look at why is it that I need to have WhatsApp and WeChat, right? Because China doesn't want WhatsApp, so I need to have WeChat if I want to communicate with my friends, right, in China. So there has been a decoupling, certainly on the social media side, for years and years. We're now starting to see the reality of a decoupling on the technology side. And China is behind when it comes to semiconductors right now. So what the Chinese government is saying, when we want to get to the next generation of semiconductors, we cannot be reliant on, you could say the West, but obviously it's Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore, the three biggest makers of semiconductors right now. So I don't know if you say the West, but you could say one versus the other. China's saying for the next generation of semiconductors, we have to be self-sufficient. And Xi Jinping says, I'm going to put my most trusted economic advisor, somebody who is a princeling like Xi Jinping, who Xi Jinping trusted, Liu He, to do the negotiations with the Trump administration for economics. So it's a very important statement that China recognizes a decoupling is here, that they can't rely on the West or, again, other countries for their technologies. It's too late for the current generation of semiconductors. So they're going to be on their own when it comes to the newest generation, and they want to be first.
And what will economic rivals, as you mentioned, the US, Japan, South Korea, but I'm just thinking more about the US here. What will they think about this? Will they feel threatened by it? Will they be concerned?
Well, you would hope that this fits into what the US is doing under the Biden administration, which is, kind of two tacks at the same time. One, we really need to compete with China, and it can't just be sanctions. We just can't put sanction after sanction after sanction on China and think we're going to win. We have to invest, and we need to do that through our infrastructure plans. We need to do that through more investment in research. And so you see a bipartisan approach in the United States saying we need to put a lot more money into R&D. We need to put a lot more money into technology, because that's exactly what China's doing. So hopefully the U.S. will invest more in itself, but then hopefully it will also have multilateral organizations that can then compete with China, because China is going to use the state to get ahead of where the United States and its allies and trading partners are.
This is happening when we talk about technology. The other element of that is the transference of technology and how people around the world access that. Interesting story that popped up this week about a Pacific undersea cable project that has now not gone the way of a Chinese manufacturer, Chinese company, Huawei, after the U.S. warned against Chinese participation. So this was going to go throughout the Pacific, right, through the Marshall Islands in that area, all the way up to Guam, correct?
Yeah, so this was an undersea cable that was going to be much better in terms of data and access, to the internet and the transfer of data, because
the satellites they use are slow. Yeah, right.
This is much faster and much better. But this tied directly into a cable that went to Guam, which is an extraordinarily important U.S. territory, especially when it comes to the U.S. military in the Pacific. Huawei was one of the companies that bid for this cable. Shockingly, Huawei bid 20% less than anybody else. Wonder why? That's what happened.
$72 million less than the nearest bid. I mean, not just a small number, right?
It's 20%. I mean, you get the state subsidies and the consortium that put together this said all bids were non-compliant. We're going to take them all off the table. Obviously, there was the U.S. had made clear it did not want to see Huawei or one of Huawei's companies, which gets access to the U.S. cables, because the opinion is Huawei is part of, if not directly part of the Chinese government. The Chinese government can order Huawei to do whatever the Chinese government tells it to do, and if it says we want to get access to all of this data, you're going to have to give it to us, Huawei. So it's not seen as a regular company. It's on the entities list from the U.S. Department of Transportation of someone U.S. companies aren't allowed to deal with. So this fits right into that broader thematic of the decoupling that is going to happen. And this sends a very strong signal to China. You can't rely on contracts from the West. You better be having your own systems in place.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I was interested in the security aspects. Washington detailed its concerns in a diplomatic note last year. They said that these firms posed a security threat. Are those concerns justified? Is there a security threat? Was there a potential security threat there?
Well, I mean, that is the debate between the United States and China. And the United States says Huawei came out of the PLA. That was its origins, that any Chinese company has got to accede to any demand or request by the Chinese government. Therefore, basically all Chinese companies are suspect, but this one is really suspect, and this sector is really, really suspect. And that's the U.S. position. And the Chinese say, look, this is just another company. It shouldn't be treated any differently. And that is not going to be solved anytime soon, this dispute between the U.S. and China, with other countries having to make the decision. Are they going to be of the U.S. position that this is a security threat, or are they going to take the Chinese position that this is just a company unlike, no different than any other?
Fascinating, Glenn, isn't it? It does seem to be a regular theme in our discussions with Steve every week. Leads into the next point you're going to bring up, this growing assertiveness of China in the region. Fascinating.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I mean, much has been said and done, and our old friend, of course, Kishore Mahbubani has a very different view on this. He was just talking at a conference in Hong Kong this past week about the rise of Asian nations, and it's fascinating. But having said that, I mean, it just tangentially, it is quite well known that many of these undersea cables have been tapped into over the decades, whether it's going from Europe to America or from the U.S. Through the Pacific. So it's not an unheard of thing that
by many nations, we shouldn't just be lapping on China.
That people access the information that is going through the fiber networks, right, Steve?
Well, you get it, yes, except, I mean, I think one of the questions would be, but if you can tap directly into it, if you own that cable, right, if that's part of if it's integrated into your national security system, that is a whole different level than coming in and eavesdropping, right, or using other forms of listening. But certainly every government is engaged in some type of you if you wanted to use the word espionage to try and get an advantage. This is seen as a line that can't be crossed by the United States, though.
Yeah. All right. Our final discussion, as Neil presaged. How you like that word?
I'm always presaging me, Glenn. Always presaging.
Sometimes you pay more for a presage. Sometimes it's less.
Sometimes I pay less, depending if I've got a wallet or not.
Depending if you get your money with you. Okay. The Atlantic Council, which is a think tank in the U.S., just came out with this new report, 15 takeaways measuring the U.S. and Chinese global influence. I'm going to put the link in the chat on Facebook Live because the graphics are beautifully done. But Steve, give us kind of an overview of what this says about U.S. versus China and their influence.
Well, so the Atlantic Council, which is a think tank in the United States, came up with this new index, and they call it the Formal Bilateral Influence Capacity Index. I guess the FBIC.
It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
So the FBIC says we're going to look at all of these elements in which countries have influence over one another. So it ranges from trade in goods to foreign aid, arms trade, diplomatic exchanges, trade agreements. Are you in the shared intergovernmental organizations? Do you have military alliances? So you take these 7 things, you mash them, all together. That's a technical statistician term, right? So you mash these 7 together. After you've measured them, you come up with this index. And over time, what we've seen using this index is that U.S. influence is generally on the waning, and Chinese influence is waxing. And it varies in different parts of the world. The U.S. is still much more influential in most of the world, much more influential in terms of countries than China is, except in Africa and Southeast Asia. And that is where China is more influential than the United States, or gaining influence. And so what the authors of this report want to show to the United States is, one, we are no longer in a unipolar world. U.S., you are now competing with China for influence. Here's the things that can help you do that, and you need to focus really on Southeast Asia, because this is where China is making the greatest gains, and where the United States cannot afford to continue to fall behind.
And just one notable point I read, China has built and maintains a strong and growing presence across all countries in the region, no surprises, with notable growth in Singapore. Singapore was highlighted specifically. What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, you look at all of the investment coming in to China. So the U.S. is still number 1 in terms of influence vis-a-vis China, but China is growing rapidly because you've always had a lot of U.S. FDI here. You've had U.S. businesses here, but now China's catching up on that part. But then you also see China engaging more with ASEAN. The Trump administration really didn't. The Biden administration hasn't yet done so, in part because of the Myanmar situation that we talked about. You see China doing trade deals. There's a China-ASEAN trade deal. You see RCEP, of which China is a member of. What does the U.S. do? The U.S. pulls out of trade agreements. The U.S. pulled out of the TPP, which had core ASEAN members, including Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore as members. So this is not a surprise at all. I think for anyone who's lived here for any period of time, we see this. We didn't need this report to see U.S. influence maybe is holding steady in Singapore, but the Chinese influence is gaining. Hopefully this will wake up some people in Washington to what certainly everybody who's listening on Facebook Live and on the radio knows.
All right. Our thanks to Steve Okun. Yet again, another interesting international news review.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Steve, for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.
Okay.
International News Review.